And then this is a summary of all of the prospective, or at least many of the prospective studies in the literature. And I just want to draw your attention to the NPV column on the right. So the likelihood with a negative MRI that the patient will still have, will not have significant cancer. And I just want to emphasize the range from 100% in this Pana-Bianco study, which was more than 1,100 patients. What this means is they did not have one patient with a negative MRI who had significant cancer. You can choose to believe that or not to believe it. Personally, I'm skeptical, particularly when you look at the other data. So negative predictive value, 76%. In PROMISE, in our study, which I'll come to, 14%, 21%, and so on. So I think that the consensus of the data is that MRI misses somewhere around 15 to 20% of significant cancer. This is another study showing that comparing biopsy-naive negative prior biopsy patients, and just to blow this up, this is the difference between systematic and targeted in both. And you can see that consistently there is a proportion of patients missed by the targeted biopsy that are identified on systematic biopsies in virtually every single one of these studies, and it's consistently around 15%. And this was a study from UCLA that just came out recently, and the same story here. MRI missed a third, 35% of significant lesions, and you can see the bars below the line are the missed lesions. Overall cancer detection rates, very significant proportion of patients were missed. And these are the randomized studies, the precision study that I mentioned, MRI first, 4M, the ASSIST study that we did, and you can see somewhere around 4 to 15% of patients or so missed if the targeted biopsy is the only biopsy that's done. So what is the explanation for this? And this is where the Bayesian approach is really critical. In other words, the pre-test probability influencing the performance of the test. And what this means, and this was very nicely outlined in this EAE guideline by Moldovan that came out 2 years ago. If you have a low-risk patient, so this would be a guy with no family history, no racial predisposition, family history, PSA is mildly elevated. He has, say, a 30% risk of prostate cancer. The NPV of the MRI is about 90%. It performs very well. If you have a higher risk patient, family history, race, PSA, say 10 to 15, that patient needs a biopsy. His NPV of the MRI is only 67%. So this, to me, is the answer to this conundrum. You have to risk stratify the patient. High risk, doesn't matter what the MRI shows, he needs a biopsy. Low risk, the MRI may reduce his risk of significant cancer from, say, 7% to 1 or 2%. If it's negative, you can skip the biopsy. And then the other thing is the learning curve. So we did a trial, which was taking men on surveillance, and we randomized them between systematic biopsy and MRI with systematic and targeted biopsies. The study was a disaster. We came up with the worst data that anyone who has studied MRI in prostate cancer has published. But it was a prospective, multi-center randomized trial. You can see here the positive predictive value of PIRADS-5 was only 33%. And this was supposedly from centers of excellence. Now, in retrospect, what happened here is we had a learning curve of the targeted biopsy. We were using the Artemis device, which is fusion targeting, and I think we showed that it takes a lot of experience to use this properly. So here's our data, and here's the precision data. PIRADS-5, 33%, 83%. Same approach, fusion targeted biopsy. Houston, there's a problem. So just bear in mind that MRI requires interpretation. It takes quite a bit of skill. The fusion targeting takes interpretation and skill, and actually doing the biopsy using the device has a learning curve, and errors can creep in. Now, it's interesting. We just had our 2-year follow-ups. from this, and despite the fact that the MRI with target biopsy didn't seem to add much, with follow-up, and we repeated the MRI group ended up doing a lot better. So the upgrading rate in the patients who had MRI with fusion targeting was much lower. It was half, 13% in the MRI arm, 27% in the biopsy arm. So the final conclusion from this study with follow-up was that the MRI had some value, it's just we didn't see the issue. Okay, next slide. Not sure what the problem is. Oh, there we go. This is one of the other randomized studies that's out there, and again, it just showed the same thing. Significant cancer is missed in the proportion of patients, 5% of target, 8% of systematic in this study. So the take-home message, MRI can replace the biopsy in some patients, the ones whose pre-test risk is not that high, but it misses about 15%, so you have to risk stratify. And this just gives an example. You have someone who, according to the nomogram, has 7% chance of grade group 2 or higher, and the MRI is negative, it drops to 2%. That's not enough of a risk to do a biopsy, in most people's opinion, whereas 40% to 15%, the patient's still at risk. Now, let me just keep going here. The MRI has limitations. It's not real time. It's 2 visits. The patient has to have the MRI, the target seen, fusion, comes back for the fusion target biopsy. It needs a radiologist. We've actually given up imaging. Urology has given up imaging to the radiologists in this area. You can miss small lesions. I've discussed that. Some patients have claustrophobia and refuse to have an MRI. Some people have a pacemaker, hip replacement, etc. So an alternative to this is high-resolution micro-ultrasound. And I just want to tell you, I'm extremely excited about this technology. I think this is really something worthwhile. It's a new invention, and it uses high-resolution ultrasound. It's 29 megahertz versus somewhere around 6 to 7 megahertz. So the key point is the resolution is 3 times greater, 70 microns, which is the diameter of a prostatic duct, versus about 200 microns with conventional ultrasound. It costs the same as a regular ultrasound, and it looks like a normal ultrasound. There's what the thing looks like. And this Primus scoring system has been developed analogous to the PIRAT system to grade the abnormalities. And I don't have time to go into detail, but just some of the patterns. So for those of you who do ultrasound, and I include myself in this, I used ultrasound mainly to guide the needle and to assess prostate volume. I never really used it to find cancer. Now you can see the cancers, and of course that takes some experience and practice. But some of the patterns, this is called bright echoes or starry night, which is associated with high-grade cancer. You see neurovascular bundle structures, you see ejaculatory duct, obviously sphincter, and you can see this is a case who had a biopsy 5 years prior. You still see the needle tracks, truly remarkable. And this shows an example of a targeted biopsy. So this is a Primus 4 lesion, a hypoechoic lesion, and instead of doing the MRI fusion targeting, bring the patient back, you see the lesion, and there's the needle, and there's no issue there that you have hit that target. So this is very gratifying from the perspective of targeting lesions. This is another one. This is a peripheral zone lesion. You can see it there, irregular borders, hypoechoic, some smudging effect, and again, the same story. There's no issue about hitting that with a biopsy needle. And then just one more. Here's an anterior lesion. This is the MRI. It doesn't show that well. But it's an anterior lesion. And again, fusion targeting, who knows how accurate that's going to be. But there you actually see the needle going through the lesion. And this is the predictive value for each Primus score. And you can see it's not as good as precision,